On September 8th, 1380, a prince who'd never won a major battle led 150,000 Russians across a river with no retreat, knowing they faced 200,000 Mongol warriors who conquered half the world. By sunset, the Golden Horde's invincibility lay shattered in Russian blood, and Eastern Europe's future hung on what happened in the next 8 hours. Think about those numbers for a second. 150,000 men gambling everything on a single day. The Mongols hadn't lost a major battle in Russia in 140 years. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how Prince Dmitry turned certain annihilation into history's most consequential upset. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see medieval Russia forever. First, the hidden ambush force that turned Mongol victory into catastrophic rout. Second, why Dmitri burned the bridges behind his own army, trapping them with death as their only companion. And third, the secret Orthodox blessing that convinced 150,000 men they couldn't lose. But here's what makes this story truly unbelievable. How did Russian peasant levies stand against Mongol horse archers who'd crushed knight orders across Europe? What fatal error did Mamay make that cost him an empire? Why did this victory fail to end Mongol rule? How could both sides suffer 70% casualties, yet one emerged triumphant? To understand how Russia broke free from the Mongol yoke, we need to step back to when Moscow itself was preparing to disappear from history. The year 1380 marked the darkest century in Russian memory. And darker still, there seemed no dawn coming. For 140 years, the Golden Horde had ruled the Russian principalities with an iron fist wrapped in calculated cruelty. Tribute collectors arrived each spring like locusts, taking gold, grain, and children for the slave markets of Sarai. Resist, and entire cities burned. The Mongols had perfected the mathematics of terror, knowing exactly how much suffering kept rebellion impossible, while keeping their subjects productive enough to exploit. Grand princes groveled in the Khan's court, kissing stirrups for the right to rule their own ancestral lands. But in Moscow's throne room, a young prince named Dmitri Ivanovich was about to commit the unthinkable: rebellion against an empire that had never known defeat on Russian soil. Think about what 140 years of occupation actually means. 6 generations of Russians had been born, lived, and died, knowing nothing but Mongol masters. Grandchildren heard stories from grandparents about a time before the conquest, but those stories sounded like fairy tales. The numbers tell the horror story better than words. Between 1237 and 1240, the Mongol invasion killed an estimated 7 million Russians, nearly half the total population. Entire cities ceased to exist. Vladimir, once home to 50,000 souls, burned to ash in 5 days. Ryazan's population of 35,000 was reduced to 0. Its citizens slaughtered so completely that wolves made dens in the ruins. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about Mongol rule. It wasn't just military domination, it was systematic psychological destruction. Every year, Russian princes were summoned to Sarai, the Horde's capital, to renew their patents to rule. The journey took months. Many never returned, executed for imagined offenses. Those who did return came back broken men who'd witnessed tortures designed to remind them exactly who held power. The Khan's court kept Russian princes waiting for weeks in deliberate humiliation, watching other rulers receive favor while they knelt in dirt. The tribute system was engineered to prevent any principality from gaining strength. Moscow paid 35,000 silver rubles annually, enough to bankrupt the richest city. Novgorod paid 40,000. Vladimir, still recovering from complete destruction, somehow had to produce 25,000. The Mongols didn't care if you starved, if your children went naked, if you sold your own people into slavery to raise the silver. Miss a payment, and the Baskaks arrived. Mongol tribute collectors who came with cavalry detachments. They took what was owed in gold, or grain, or human flesh. But Mamay, the power behind the Golden Horde's throne in 1380, had made one critical miscalculation. He'd assumed terror would last forever, that Russians would remain cowed as they'd been for 140 years. He didn't understand that a people oppressed long enough eventually reach a point where they'd rather die fighting than live kneeling. In Moscow, Dmitri Ivanovich was betting Russia's existence on exactly that transformation. What happened next would either vindicate his gamble or end Russian independence forever. Dmitri Ivanovich stood before his boyars in the winter of 1378 and spoke words that should have gotten him killed. "No more tribute," he told Moscow's assembled nobles, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was proposing. The reaction was immediate horror mixed with secret exhilaration. For a generation, Russian princes had dreamed of this moment. But dreams don't defeat Mongol cavalry. Dmitri was 30 years old, untested in major battle, ruling a principality that could barely muster 20,000 fighting men. Yet he possessed something his predecessors lacked: a unified coalition of Russian princes who were finally, impossibly, willing to stand together. But unity means nothing if the enemy can simply crush you with numbers. And the numbers were terrifying. Mamay, the power behind the Golden Horde's throne, commanded resources that dwarfed anything Russia could assemble. Here's what made Dmitri's declaration genuinely insane. The last Russian prince who'd refused tribute, Mikhail of Tver in 1327, had been dragged to Sarai in chains. The Mongols stripped his skin off while he was still alive, then displayed his flayed corpse in the city square for 3 months as a lesson. Every Russian prince knew this story. Every prince had nightmares about it. Yet Dmitri was proposing exactly the same defiance 53 years later. The mathematics of rebellion seemed impossible. Moscow's treasury held perhaps 12,000 rubles, barely a third of 1 year's tribute payment. Dmitri's standing army numbered 8,000 men, mostly poorly equipped infantry. Against this, Mamay commanded the entire Golden Horde, a military machine that stretched from Poland to the Urals. Conservative estimates put Mamay's available forces at 300,000 warriors. Think about that ratio. 300,000 against 8,000. That's a 37-to-1 disadvantage before the fighting even starts. But Dmitri had been planning this moment since he'd become Grand Prince at age 9. 21 years of careful diplomacy, of building alliances, of secretly stockpiling weapons while appearing completely loyal. He'd learned something crucial that other princes had missed. The Golden Horde was weaker than it appeared. Mamay wasn't actually the Khan, just a powerful warlord who'd seized control during a succession crisis. Half the Mongol tribes didn't recognize his authority. Here's where Dmitri's strategy becomes brilliant. He wasn't just refusing tribute. He was betting that other principalities would follow Moscow's lead if someone took the first step. Within months of his declaration, Suicidal joined the rebellion, then Vladimir, then Rostov. The coalition Dmitri had spent 2 decades building was finally activating. By spring of 1380, 7 major principalities had stopped paying tribute. Russia hadn't been this unified since before the Mongol conquest. Mamay received the news in his palace at Sarai, and his reaction was exactly what Dmitri had feared. Not negotiation, not measured response. Total war. The warlord who'd held the horde together through brutal displays of force couldn't afford to show weakness now. If Russia escaped tribute, every subject people from the Caucasus to the Volga would rebel. By summer, scouts brought terrifying reports to Moscow. Mamay was gathering the largest army the Golden Horde had assembled in 50 years. 200,000 warriors were converging on Sarai. Their destination was obvious. Moscow would burn, and this time, the Mongols would make sure it never rose again. The message arrived at Mamay's court in Sarai like a slap across the face of God himself. Moscow refusing tribute wasn't rebellion, it was suicide, and Mamay intended to demonstrate why. By spring of 1380, the most powerful military machine in the known world began its terrible mobilization. 200,000 warriors, drawn from every corner of the Horde's vast empire. Mongol heavy cavalry, their composite bows, capable of penetrating chainmail at 200 yards. Tatar horse archers who could fire 20 arrows per minute while riding at full gallop. Mercenary Genoese crossbowmen with steel-tipped bolts. Alan and Circassian allies bringing their own traditions of mounted warfare. The logistics alone staggered the imagination. Enough horses to darken the steppe, enough arrows to blot out the sun. Mamay's scouts reported Moscow could muster perhaps 70,000, maybe 80,000, if every principality contributed. The mathematics were simple. Russia would cease to exist. The mobilization began in March of 1380, and its scale defied comprehension. From the steppes north of the Caspian Sea came 40,000 Mongol heavy cavalry, descendants of the warriors who'd conquered half the known world under Genghis Khan. From the Crimea, 35,000 Tatar horse archers, men who'd learned to ride before they could walk. From the Caucasus Mountains, 20,000 Alan and Circassian warriors, fierce mountain fighters who brought their own savage traditions to the battlefield. Mamay even hired 5,000 Genoese crossbowmen from their trading posts on the Black Sea. Professional mercenaries whose steel-tipped bolts could punch through shields at 300 yards. Think about what 200,000 warriors actually means. If they marched in a column 4 men wide, the line would stretch 70 miles. The horse herd alone numbered over 300,000 animals, their hooves capable of drinking a river dry in a single day. Supply wagons carrying arrows, spare weapons, and preserved meat stretched for another 20 miles behind the army. The dust cloud raised by this massive host could be seen for 50 miles in clear weather. Here's what made this army particularly terrifying. These weren't conscripts or levies. Every single warrior was a professional soldier who trained from childhood. Mongol boys learned to shoot composite bows from horseback at age 5. By 10, they could hit a moving target at 100 yards while riding at full gallop. By 15, they were veterans of border raids and tribal wars. The men Mamay gathered had an average of 20 years of combat experience each. They'd fought Byzantine cataphracts, Polish knights, Hungarian infantry, and Bulgar cavalry. They'd won every time. The weapons technology favored the Mongols overwhelmingly. Their composite bows, made from horn, wood, and sinew, had a draw weight of 160 pounds, nearly double what European longbows could manage. This meant greater range, better penetration, and the ability to kill armored men at distances where those men couldn't fight back. Each archer carried 60 arrows in his quiver, and Mongol logistics meant resupply was constant. A Mongol army could fire 30,000 arrows per minute and sustain that rate for hours. But Mamay wasn't just gathering an army. He was making a statement. The Genoese crossbowmen cost him 15,000 gold dinars, enough to fund a small kingdom for a year. He paid it without hesitation. The message was clear. Money was no object. Mercy would not exist. Russia had challenged the Golden Horde's authority, and the response would be so overwhelming, so total, that no subject people would ever dare rebel again. By August, this apocalyptic host began its march north toward Russian territory. Scouts reported its progress with mounting terror. The army moved slowly, deliberately, like a storm front that couldn't be stopped or survived. Mamay himself rode at its head, surrounded by his personal guard of 5,000 Mamluks, warriors who'd sworn to die before allowing their commander to fall. He'd brought his entire mobile palace, massive tents of silk where he held court each evening, dispensing justice and planning Russia's destruction. The Russian spies who watched this mobilization brought back reports that seemed impossible. 200,000 seemed like exaggeration, a number designed to spread panic. But multiple sources confirmed it. The largest Christian army in Eastern Europe had perhaps 80,000 men total, scattered across dozens of cities and fortresses. Mamay was bringing 200,000 to one battlefield. As the Mongol horde crossed into Russian territory in late August, burning villages as it came, one question haunted every Russian from Moscow to Novgorod. Could Dmitri's coalition possibly stand against this? The mathematics said no. History said no. Logic said no. But Dmitri was about to prove that sometimes mathematics don't account for desperation. But something unprecedented was happening across the Russian principalities in the summer of 1380. Dmitri's call to arms wasn't being ignored. It was being answered with a fervor that shocked even him. From Novgorod in the north came 10,000 men. Suicidal contributed 8,000. Vladimir sent 12,000. Ryazan, playing both sides as always, sent token forces while secretly corresponding with Mamay. Yet the others came willingly, bringing not just soldiers, but a fury that had festered for 140 years. These weren't professional warriors. Most were farmers and craftsmen who'd spent their lives watching Mongol tax collectors take everything. Now they were being offered something impossible, a chance to fight back. By late August, 150,000 Russians had assembled near Moscow, the largest Christian army Eastern Europe had ever seen. But gathering men is one thing. Turning them into an army capable of facing Mongol veterans was another matter entirely. The numbers tell an extraordinary story. Think about this. 150,000 men represented nearly 5% of the entire Russian population. In modern terms, that would be like the United States mobilizing 15 million soldiers for a single battle. Every town, every village had sent its men. Smolensk contributed 9,000. Bryansk sent 7,000. Even tiny Pereslavl managed to raise 4,000 warriors. The camps around Moscow stretched for miles, cook fires numberless as stars, the sound of men drilling with unfamiliar weapons echoing across the plains. Here's what made this gathering genuinely miraculous. These men came knowing the odds. Scouts brought daily reports of Mamay's approaching horde, 200,000 strong, undefeated in living memory. The mathematics were brutal, yet still they came. Fathers brought sons. Brothers marched together. Some villages sent every male over 15, knowing they might return to empty homes. The desperation that drove them transcended logic. Better to die fighting than live another 140 years watching your children taken as slaves. But desperation alone doesn't win battles. And Dmitri's army had terrifying weaknesses. Of the 150,000 men assembled, perhaps 30,000 had any real military training. These were the professional Druzhina warriors, the boyar cavalry, the men who'd fought in border skirmishes and knew which end of a spear to hold. The remaining 120,000 were militia, farmers who'd been given weapons 3 weeks ago and told to learn fast. Their equipment reflected this reality. The professionals wore chainmail or lamellar armor and carried quality weapons. The militia wore padded jackets and carried whatever they could find: hunting spears, wood-cutting axes, knives lashed to poles. The training challenge was insurmountable. You can't create Mongol-quality cavalry in 3 weeks. You can't teach peasants to hold formation against charging horses in a month. Dmitri's commanders worked desperately, drilling the men dawn to dusk, but everyone knew the truth. When Mongol horse archers started killing from 300 yards away, these farmers would break. They'd run, and running men died faster than fighting men. Yet something was happening in those camps that Dmitri's officers didn't quite understand. Every evening, priests moved through the ranks, blessing weapons, hearing confessions, promising paradise to those who fell fighting the pagan horde. The men weren't just being trained, they were being transformed. They weren't learning to be professional soldiers, they were learning to be fanatics. And fanatics, properly led, could sometimes achieve what professionals couldn't. By September 1st, the army was as ready as it would ever be. 150,000 men, most of whom would be dead in a week, waited for their prince to lead them against an enemy that outnumbered them and outclassed them in every measurable way. But Dmitri had one more move to make. A spiritual gambit that would either save Russia or be remembered as the final delusion of a doomed kingdom. He was riding to see Sergius of Radonej, and what happened in that monastery would determine whether 150,000 men marched to victory or to the largest massacre in Russian history. On August 27, 1380, Dmitri did something that would echo through Russian history for centuries. He rode to the Trinity Monastery and knelt before Sergius of Radonej, the most revered holy man in Russia. What happened in that private meeting remains one of history's most significant mysteries. When Dmitri emerged hours later, witnesses claimed his face shone with otherworldly confidence. Sergius had given him something more valuable than soldiers: absolute spiritual certainty. The elderly monk reportedly told Dmitri, "Go without fear. God is with you. You will triumph." But Sergius did more than bless. He sent 2 monks to accompany the army. Peresvet and Oslayabia, former warriors who'd taken monastic vows, now released to fight one final battle. The symbolism was overwhelming. Even God's servants were joining this fight. When word spread through the Russian camp, the psychological impact was seismic. Men who'd been terrified now believed they couldn't lose, that heaven itself had chosen sides. Here's what made Sergius's blessing militarily significant beyond mere morale. The elderly monk was 70 years old, venerated across every Russian principality as a living saint. When he spoke, princes obeyed. Peasants considered his words literally divine. His monastery had survived the Mongol conquest by miraculous reputation alone, the one place the horde's commanders refused to burn. For Sergius to declare this battle righteous meant every Russian warrior could die believing paradise awaited. That certainty transforms men from soldiers into weapons. The 2 monks Sergius sent were strategic choices that showed the old man understood warfare as well as theology. Peresvet had been a boyar warrior before taking vows, a man who'd killed 30 enemies in single combat before finding God. Oslayabia had commanded cavalry units for Vladimir before entering monastic life. These weren't peaceful monks being forced into violence. They were killers who tried to escape their nature, now given divine permission to return to it. When they rode into Dmitri's camp wearing chainmail under their robes, warriors wept openly. Think about the psychological transformation this created. 150,000 men, most of whom expected to die, suddenly believed their deaths had cosmic meaning. They weren't just fighting Mongols, they were soldiers of God, fighting demons in human form. The priests moved through the camps with new fervor. baptizing men who'd never bothered with religion, administering final communion to entire regiments. By September 1st, Dmitri's army had become something unprecedented in Russian history. A holy crusade blessed by Russia's greatest living saint. But Sergius's blessing contained a hidden element that few understood. The old monk had told Dmitri, "You will triumph, but the cost will be terrible. Many will die. Most who march will not return." This was no guaranteed victory. It was a prophecy of mutual slaughter. Dmitri kept this part private, sharing it only with his closest commanders. The men needed to believe in victory, not just meaningful death. The timing of the blessing was also crucial. By August 27th, Mamay's army was just 5 days' march from Russian territory. Dmitri had perhaps 2 weeks to intercept the Mongol host before it reached Moscow. The blessing wasn't just spiritual preparation. It was the final piece of a tactical puzzle. Dmitri needed his men to march fast, to attack aggressively, to stand when every instinct screamed to run. Sergius had just given him the psychological weapon to demand exactly that. By September 2nd, 150,000 Russians began their march south toward the Don River, where scouts reported Mamay's 200,000 warriors were converging. Every man carried Sergius's blessing like armor. Every regiment had been blessed by priests who promised paradise. The transformation from terrified militia to religious fanatics was complete. What none of them knew was that Dmitri had one more impossible decision to make. A tactical gamble so extreme it would either save Russia or doom it forever. At the Don River, he would face a choice no sane commander would make. By September 7th, Dmitri's massive host reached the Don River, and the prince made a decision that military logic screamed against. "Burn the bridges," he ordered. His commanders stared in disbelief. Burning bridges meant no retreat, no escape if the battle turned against them. It meant fight or die, with death the only certainty if they lost. But Dmitri understood something profound about human psychology. Men with an escape route think about escaping. Men with no escape route think about winning. As Russian soldiers watched their bridges burn, sending black smoke curling into the September sky, something changed in them. The terror that had paralyzed Russian resistance for 140 years began transforming into desperate courage. They'd cross the Don to face the Mongol host. Now they would defeat it or join the countless Russians who died under Mongol swords. There would be no third option, no negotiation, no surrender. Dmitri had engineered a scenario where his untested army had no choice but to become heroes or corpses. The historical parallels were ominous. Cortes had burned his ships in Mexico with just 600 men. William the Conqueror had beached his fleet at Hastings with 7,000. Dmitri was doing it with 150,000, betting the entire future of Russia on a single roll of the dice. His senior commanders, men who'd spent lifetimes studying warfare, argued desperately against it. "We need an escape route," Prince Vladimir Andreevich pleaded. "If we break, we'll be slaughtered at the water's edge." Dmitri's response became legend. "We won't break because we can't break. God and the Don behind us, the enemy before us. We go forward or we die here." The Don crossing itself was a logistical nightmare that consumed September 5th through 7th. 150,000 men, 30,000 horses, supply wagons, and artillery pieces funneling across 3 wooden bridges. The bridges groaned under the weight, timbers cracking, engineers working frantically to shore up supports. The crossing took 48 hours of continuous movement, men marching in darkness, horses being led carefully to avoid panic. By September 7th at noon, the last Russian soldier stood on the southern bank. At 1 p.m., Dmitri gave the order. torches were set to the bridges. Think about what this meant to the common soldier. These were men who joined expecting their princes to negotiate some face-saving compromise at the last moment. Now they watched their only escape route consumed by flames. The psychological shock rippled through the army like an earthquake. Some men wept, others prayed louder. A few dozen deserted, trying to swim the dawn, but most drowned in their armor. The rest stood transfixed, watching orange flames dance against gray September skies. Here's where Dmitri's gambit either becomes genius or catastrophic stupidity. The Don crossing put the Russian army on a peninsula formed by the Don and Dnieper rivers. Behind them, water. Before them, rolling plains stretching toward Kulikovo field, where Mongol scouts had already been spotted. They had perhaps 4 miles of ground to fight on, hemmed in by rivers on 3 sides. If the battle went badly, 150,000 men would be trapped against the water with nowhere to run. But Dmitri had chosen this ground deliberately. The terrain favored infantry over cavalry. Forests on the flanks, limiting Mongol mobility. The river behind them meant Mamay couldn't use his favorite tactic of envelopment. The Mongol horsemen who destroyed so many armies by surrounding them would have limited room to maneuver. It was a calculated risk. Trade, mobility for cohesion, bet everything on one massive collision of armies. That night, September 7th, 150,000 Russians camped on Kulikovo field, the dawn burning behind them. Mamay's 200,000 warriors just 8 miles away. Priests moved through the ranks giving final blessings. Men wrote letters they'd never send, scratching words in dirt because most couldn't write. Warriors sharpened weapons that would be used by dawn. The stars came out cold and clear, and everyone knew by sunset tomorrow, most of them would be dead. What none of them could know was that just 8 miles to the south, Mamay was making his own tactical error, one that would cost him everything he'd spent a lifetime building. September 8th dawned gray and cold over Kulikovo field, a rolling plain between the Don and Dnieper rivers. By 6 a.m., Mamay's 200,000 warriors had deployed in a formation that had terrorized Eurasia for 150 years. The center held his heavy cavalry, 40,000 Mongol and Tatar veterans whose grandparents had conquered Russia's ancestors. The wings spread wide, 60,000 horse archers on each side, ready to envelop and destroy. Behind them, reserves numbering 40,000, including Mamay's personal guard. The Genoese crossbowmen, 5,000 strong, anchored strategic points. Battle standards fluttered in the morning breeze, displaying the tamgas of tribes from the Urals to the Black Sea. To Russian scouts observing from the tree line, it looked like the steppe itself had come to life, a sea of horses and men stretching beyond sight. The sound was overwhelming. 200,000 horses stamping, men calling prayers to Allah, armor clanking, bowstrings being tested. Mamay himself, seated on a hilltop throne, watched with cold satisfaction. By sunset, Russia would remember why empires don't fall. The deployment was textbook Mongol doctrine, perfected through 150 years of conquest. Let that sink in for a second. Every warrior in that formation had studied the same tactics that had crushed Baghdad, destroyed Kiev, shattered the Hungarian army at Mohi. The 40,000 heavy cavalry in the center weren't just soldiers. They were the elite of the elite. Mongol nobles, each commanding 10 men, organized in units of hundreds and thousands, with ruthless efficiency. They wore lamellar armor that could turn sword strikes, carried lances for the initial charge, and had sabers for close combat. Their horses, Mongolian steppe breeds, could travel 50 miles per day and still fight at the end. But the real killing power sat on the wings. 120,000 horse archers, 60,000 on each flank, represented the most lethal force projection system medieval warfare had ever seen. These men could fire accurately at 200 yards while riding at full gallop. Each carried 60 arrows, meaning the wings alone could unleash 7 million arrows. Think about that. 7 million projectiles, any one of which could kill a man. The mathematics of archery warfare favored the Mongols so overwhelmingly that most enemies broke before the wings even closed distance. Here's what made this army genuinely unstoppable. The average Mongol warrior had 15 years of combat experience. They'd fought in campaigns from Poland to Persia. They knew a dozen different formations, could execute complex maneuvers using flag signals visible for miles, and maintained iron discipline even during rout and pursuit. Russian militia, who'd been training for 3 weeks, were about to face men who'd literally been born in the saddle. The Genoese crossbowmen added a terrifying European element. 5,000 professional mercenaries armed with steel crossbows that could punch through any armor at 300 yards. Mamay had positioned them carefully, protecting his flank's weak points, ready to pour bolt fire into any Russian breakthrough attempt. They'd been paid triple wages for this battle, enough gold to retire on. They intended to earn it. Mamay surveys the field from his hilltop command post, and everything he sees confirms victory. His scouts reported the Russian army at 150,000, badly equipped, poorly trained, trapped against the Don River. The mathematics were simple. 200,000 veterans against 150,000 militia. His wings would envelop the Russian flanks while his center pinned them in place. The reserves would deliver the killing blow. By noon, the field would be carpeted with Russian dead. By sunset, Moscow would be defenseless. But Mamay had made one critical miscalculation, a tactical error so subtle that even his most experienced commanders missed it. He'd positioned his army on open ground, maximizing mobility, playing to Mongol cavalry strengths. What he didn't realize was that the forests flanking Kulikovo field weren't empty. And what waited in those trees would turn his textbook deployment into a death trap. At 7 a.m., Russian battle horns sounded across the plain, and 150,000 men who'd been blessed by saints, who'd burned their bridges, who had nowhere to retreat, began their advance into the teeth of the Mongol Empire. What happened at 8 a.m. that morning passed into legend before the real battle even began. Following ancient steppe tradition, both armies sent forth champions for single combat. The psychological stakes were enormous. Whoever won might claim divine favor in the eyes of 150,000 Russians wavering between courage and terror. The Mongols chose Chelubey, a giant warrior whose reputation preceded him like death itself. 7 feet tall, having killed dozens of opponents in ritual duels, Chelubey rode forward on a massive warhorse, his armor gleaming, his lance as thick as a young tree. The Russians sent forth Peresvet. The monk warrior Sergius had blessed. Witnesses claimed Peresvet wore no armor, just his monk's robes, a wooden cross around his neck. The two champions charged from opposite ends of the field, building to full gallop, 400 yards becoming 300, 200, 100. The impact when they met could be heard across the entire plain, both lances striking home with lethal force. Both warriors fell dead from their saddles simultaneously, their horses continuing riderless past each other. The duel ended in mutual destruction, but Russians saw it differently. Their champion had matched the Mongol giant, dying, yes, but taking their greatest warrior with him. If a monk could do that, what could an army do? Here's what made Chelubey so terrifying. The chronicles record he'd killed 73 men in single combat over 20 years. 73. He'd fought Byzantine champions, Polish knights, rival Mongol warriors. He'd never lost. His armor weighed 90 pounds, yet he moved in it like water. When he rode forward, 200,000 Mongol warriors roared their approval, certain this duel would break Russian morale before the real fighting began. The psychological weapon was deliberate. Show the Russians their holy monk dying on Mongol steel. Prove their god had abandoned them. Peresvet's choice to ride without armor was either suicidal bravery or tactical genius. Chronicles claim he did it deliberately, accepting death to ensure his lance struck true. With no armor weight, his horse ran faster, hit harder. The physics were brutal. 2 horses at full gallop, combined weight and momentum exceeding 2 tons, meeting in a collision that made the earth shake. Both lances penetrated completely. Chelubey's punching through Peresvet's chest, Peresvet's driving through Mongol armor and into the giant's heart. Think about the timing. Both men died in the same instant. But Peresvet stayed mounted for 3 seconds longer, riding forward even as life left him before finally falling. Those 3 seconds meant everything. To superstitious medieval warriors watching from both lines, it seemed the Russian champion had outlasted the Mongol. Divine favor had been demonstrated. The reaction in the Russian ranks was electric. Men who'd been trembling steadied their spears. Warriors who'd expected to run found courage they didn't know existed. Sergius had sent them a champion who'd matched Chelubey, the invincible Mongol, death for death. If God protected a single monk that thoroughly, what would he do for 150,000 faithful? But on the Mongol side, doubt crept in for the first time. Chelubey had never fallen. His death should have been impossible. Was this battle truly blessed? Did Allah favor the Christians today? At 8:15 a.m., with both champions' bodies cooling on blood-soaked ground, Dmitri gave the order. 150,000 Russians began their advance across Kulikovo field, believing heaven itself marched with them. What happened in the next 4 hours would determine whether that faith was justified or whether they'd all die for believing in miracles. At 10 a.m. exactly, Mamay gave the signal, and 200,000 Mongol warriors began their advance. The sound was apocalyptic, like thunder rolling across the plain that wouldn't stop. 60,000 horse archers swept forward from both wings, their technique perfected over centuries. At 300 yards, the first arrows rose, darkening the sky like a locust swarm. The Russian shield wall bristled with shafts, men screaming as bodkin points punched through wood and steel. But the arrows were just the beginning, softening the formation for what came next. At 200 yards, the Mongol heavy cavalry began their charge. 40,000 armored horsemen building to a gallop that made the earth shake. Russian commanders screamed orders, but their voices were lost in the roar. The mathematical horror was undeniable. 40,000 experienced cavalry hitting 70,000 infantry, most of whom had never seen battle. Military theory said the Russian center should collapse in minutes. But something happened that shouldn't have been possible. The Russian infantry held. They held. The arrow storm alone should have broken them. 60,000 horse archers firing at will meant 30,000 arrows per minute hitting the Russian lines. Think about that volume of fire. 30,000 projectiles every 60 seconds, each capable of killing. The front Russian ranks literally disappeared under the assault, men falling with multiple shafts through chest, neck, face. The screaming was constant, a sound that would haunt survivors forever. Shields splintered, armor failed. Blood sprayed across men standing behind the dying. But here's what made the Russian formation genuinely revolutionary. Dmitri had deployed his infantry 10 ranks deep, not the standard 3 or 4. When the front rank fell, the second stepped forward into the gaps. When the second died, the third advanced. The Mongols had never faced this kind of depth. Normally, arrow storms created panic, holes in formation, and cavalry exploited those holes. But with 10 ranks, there were no exploitable holes, just fresh warriors stepping over their dead comrades to maintain the wall. At 10:05, the Mongol heavy cavalry struck, and the impact was cataclysmic. The first 3 Russian ranks simply ceased to exist, crushed under 2 tons of horseflesh and rider moving at 30 miles per hour. Men flew backward, bones shattering audibly. The Mongol lances, 12 feet of ashwood tipped with steel, punched through shields, armor, and bodies before breaking. But the Mongol riders, expecting to smash through and wheel away, found themselves trapped in the Russian formation. The 4th rank, then the 5th, pressed forward with spears, stabbing upward at riders, at horses, at anything Mongol. The fighting became intimate and savage. Mongol cavalrymen, masters of mobility warfare, found themselves in a grinding close-quarters brawl where experience mattered less than desperation. Russian farmers who'd never killed anything larger than a pig were pulling Mongol veterans from saddles, stabbing them on the ground with crude spears. The noise was beyond description. Horses screaming, men dying in 3 languages, steel hitting steel, flesh, bone. By 10:15, something impossible was happening. The Russian center, which should have collapsed in 5 minutes, was still standing. 40,000 Mongol heavy cavalry had achieved penetration, but not breakthrough. They'd pushed perhaps 50 yards into Russian ranks, but 70,000 infantry had absorbed them like water-absorbing rocks. Mamay, watching from his hilltop, couldn't believe his eyes. His center, his elite warriors, were bogging down. This had never happened. Mongol doctrine depended on mobility, speed, the ability to strike and withdraw. His cavalry was trapped in a meat grinder, taking casualties without gaining ground. What he didn't know was that this was exactly Dmitri's plan. Hold the center at any cost, absorb the Mongol strength, and wait for the wings to collapse. Because the Russian flanks were already breaking, and when they broke completely, the real battle would begin. The Mongol heavy cavalry struck the Russian center like a siege ram hitting a castle gate, and for 30 seconds, the outcome seemed inevitable. Russian front ranks simply ceased to exist, crushed under hooves or impaled on lances. Men flew backward, bones shattering, blood spraying across those behind them. The Mongol second wave hit before the first had even cleared, exploiting every gap, every moment of hesitation. Russian sergeants screamed at their men to hold, but holding against trained Mongol cavalry was like asking men to stop an avalanche with their bodies. Yet impossibly, the 3rd Russian rank stepped forward into the gaps left by the dead. Then the 4th, then the 5th. These weren't trained soldiers. They were farmers and merchants who'd never held a spear in anger before this morning. But Sergius's blessing had infected them with something more powerful than training. Absolute conviction they were fighting for God against the devil himself. When a Mongol lancer penetrated 20 feet into Russian ranks, the infantry swarmed him, pulling him from his horse, stabbing upward with desperate ferocity. The Mongols had faced courage before. They'd never faced this particular kind of suicidal faith. By 10:30, the casualty numbers defied belief. The Russian center had lost 15,000 men in 30 minutes. 15,000 dead or dying in half an hour. Let that sink in. 500 deaths per minute. Yet the line held because 55,000 men remained. Still 10 ranks deep in most places, still pressing forward over the bodies of their comrades. The mathematics of attrition favored the Russians in a way Mamay hadn't anticipated. His 40,000 cavalry were taking casualties too, and every fallen Mongol represented years of training lost. Every fallen Russian was being replaced by another farmer with a spear. Here's what the Mongol commanders couldn't understand. Russian soldiers were dying and advancing simultaneously. When a man took an arrow through the chest, he'd fall forward, not back, pushing toward the enemy even as life left him. When cavalry trampled the front rank, the second rank would step onto their bodies, using the dead as stepping stones to reach Mongol riders. This wasn't tactics. It was collective insanity driven by religious certainty. The fighting reached a ferocity that shocked veterans on both sides. A Russian merchant from Vladimir, hit by 3 arrows, pulled a Mongol from his saddle and bit through the man's throat before dying. A farmer from Suicidal, his arm severed at the elbow, picked up his own detached limb and swung it as a weapon before collapsing. These stories sound impossible, but they're recorded in chronicles from both sides. Desperation and faith had created something beyond human soldiers. They'd created martyrs who fought like demons. Dmitri himself fought in the front ranks, wearing common armor so his men wouldn't know their prince was in danger. By 1045, he'd taken 2 wounds, a saber cut across his ribs and a spear graze on his thigh. His bodyguards begged him to withdraw. He refused, knowing if the men saw their prince retreat, the entire line would collapse. But here's the terrifying reality Dmitri could see from his position. The center was holding, yes, but at a cost that couldn't be sustained. They were losing 500 men per minute. At this rate, the entire center would be dead by noon. And worse, far worse, the flanks were already crumbling. 60,000 Mongol horse archers were systematically destroying the Russian cavalry wings. And when those wings broke completely, the center would be surrounded. The battle's fulcrum was approaching. Hold 30 more minutes, and Dmitri's hidden reserve might save them. Break in the next 5 minutes, and 150,000 Russians would die trapped against the Don River. But faith alone couldn't hold the flanks. By 11 a.m., Dmitri's worst nightmare was unfolding on both sides of his formation. The Russian cavalry wings, outnumbered 2-to-1 by Mongol horse archers, were being systematically destroyed. The Mongol wings executed their standard tactic with devastating precision: wheel, fire, withdraw, wheel again. Russian cavalry tried to charge them, but Mongol horses were faster, more agile, bred for this exact warfare. Every time Russians seemed to make contact, the Mongols simply flowed away, leaving only corpses behind. Worse, the constant movement was drawing Russian cavalry away from the center, opening dangerous gaps in the formation. By 11:15, the Russian right wing was in full retreat, 5,000 men streaming back toward the Don, pursued by 20,000 Mongols. The left wing held slightly better, but was being pushed steadily back. Mamay, watching from his hilltop command post, saw victory approaching. Once the wings broke completely, his cavalry could envelope the Russian center, and infantry surrounded by cavalry dies screaming. He sent his reserves forward, 40,000 fresh warriors moving to deliver the killing blow. In that moment, the Battle of Kulikovo seemed finished. Russia's gamble had failed. The casualty disparity on the flanks was catastrophic. The Russian right wing had lost 8,000 of its original 15,000 cavalry in just 60 minutes. 8,000 mounted warriors, most of them boyar professionals, cut down by arrows they never saw coming. The Mongol wings had lost perhaps 2,000 total. Think about that exchange ratio. 4 Russians dead for every Mongol. This was the mathematics that had conquered empires. Here's what made Mongol horse archer tactics so devastatingly effective. They never committed to close combat. At 200 yards, they'd loose arrows while riding parallel to Russian cavalry. When Russians charged, the Mongols would wheel away at angles that kept them always out of reach, but still in bow range. Russian horses, heavier and bred for shock charges, couldn't match the endurance of steppe ponies. After 30 minutes of fruitless pursuit, Russian cavalry would be exhausted, their horses foaming and stumbling. That's when the Mongols would wheel back and massacre them. By 1120, the tactical situation had become untenable. The Russian center still held, but now it was fighting on three sides. Mongol cavalry was pressing the front, and both flanks were being rolled up from the sides. The formation was compressing, 70,000 infantry being squeezed into a smaller and smaller space. Men couldn't swing weapons properly. The wounded had nowhere to fall back. Bodies of the dead remained standing, held upright by the press of living, soldiers around them. Mamay's 40,000 reserves hit the Russian left flank at 11:25, and the impact was sledgehammer brutal. These were fresh warriors against exhausted Russians who'd been fighting for 90 minutes. The Russian left wing, which had been holding desperately, simply shattered. 10,000 cavalry broke and ran toward the Don, abandoning the infantry center to its fate. Dmitri, bleeding from multiple wounds, saw his army disintegrating. The center had lost 20,000 men. The flanks had lost 18,000. 38,000 Russians dead in 90 minutes, and the killing was accelerating. In the forest to his left, 20,000 cavalry sat motionless under Prince Vladimir's command, watching their nation die, waiting for a signal that seemed like it would never come. But Dmitri was waiting for one specific moment. Not yet. Not yet. The Mongols had to commit everything, had to believe victory was certain, had to make the fatal mistake of forgetting that battles aren't over until every enemy is accounted for. What happened in the next 5 minutes would either vindicate Dmitri's gamble or end Russia forever. Noon brought scenes that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The Russian center, now fighting on three sides as Mongol cavalry exploited the collapsed wings, began dying in industrial quantities. Every minute, hundreds of men fell, trampled or cut down. The noise was beyond description. The screaming of wounded horses mixing with the cries of dying men, the clash of steel on steel, orders being shouted in 3 languages. The air itself became poisonous, filled with dust and blood spray, men choking on it while they fought. Dmitri himself, fighting in the front ranks wearing a simple soldier's armor so his men wouldn't know their prince was in danger, took multiple wounds. A Mongol saber cut his shoulder. A spear grazed his ribs. He fell twice, pulled back to his feet by his bodyguard. Around him, the Russian formation was compressing under pressure. 70,000 men being slowly crushed into a smaller and smaller space. The Don River lay just 2 miles behind them. If they broke now, they'd be slaughtered at the water's edge. Russia's army destroyed, Moscow defenseless. But in the forest to the left, 20,000 Russian cavalry sat motionless, watching their countrymen die, waiting for a signal that hadn't come. The casualty rate had reached apocalyptic levels. Between 10 a.m. and noon, 45,000 Russians had fallen. 45,000 in 2 hours. That's 375 dead per minute, 6 deaths every single second. The Russian center, which had started with 70,000 infantry, now numbered perhaps 35,000 still standing. Half their strength gone in 120 minutes of continuous combat. Here's what made noon the critical moment. The Russian formation had compressed from its original mile-wide front to barely 400 yards. 35,000 men packed so tightly they could barely move. The Mongols, sensing imminent collapse, pressed harder. Mamay's reserves, now fully committed, were grinding into the Russian flanks. The mathematical end was approaching. At current casualty rates, the Russian center would cease to exist by 1 p.m. Dmitri, blood streaming from a head wound he didn't remember receiving, could barely see through the red haze covering his vision. His bodyguards had formed a ring around him, but they were dying too. His closest companion, a boyar named Mikhail, who'd fought beside him for 10 years, took a Mongol arrow through the eye and fell without a sound. Another guard lost his arm to a cavalry saber, the limb spinning away in a spray of arterial blood. But through the chaos, Dmitri watched the Mongol deployment with calculating eyes. Mamay had committed everything. All 40,000 reserves were engaged. The two wings, having routed the Russian flanks, were now wheeling inward to crush the center. 180,000 Mongol warriors, virtually the entire army, were focused on destroying the remaining Russians. Their formations had lost coherence, units mixing, command structure fracturing as victory seemed seconds away. This was the moment. The Mongols believed they'd won. Their discipline was breaking as warriors competed for glory in the final slaughter. And their left flank, so focused on crushing Russians before them, had drifted east, away from the forest, exposing their entire side. Dmitri raised his bloodied sword, and a runner sprinted toward the tree line, carrying the signal Prince Vladimir had been waiting 2 hours to receive. 20,000 Russian cavalry, hidden and fresh, were about to be unleashed on an enemy that had forgotten they existed. At 1 p.m., something changed on Kulikovo field. Something only a commander watching the entire battle could see. Mamay's 200,000 warriors were no longer a disciplined formation. They were a mob. The center had overcommitted, chasing glory, their neat ranks dissolving into thousands of individual combats. The wings, having routed the Russian flanks, had scattered in pursuit, discipline abandoned for the joy of the chase. The reserves, sent forward to deliver the final blow, were fully engaged, no longer reserves at all. For the first time in 6 hours, the Mongol army had no uncommitted forces, no response to a new threat. And their left flank, so focused on crushing the Russian center, had drifted east, away from the forest, exposing their entire side to anyone watching from those trees. On the Russian side, what remained of Dmitri's center, perhaps 35,000 men from the original 70,000, were compressed into a desperate square. They couldn't advance. They couldn't retreat. But they hadn't broken. Behind them, the rest of the army, the survivors from the wings, the walking wounded, everyone who could still hold a weapon, waited for miracle or annihilation. Then, impossibly, a rider burst from the compressed Russian square, racing toward the forest. He carried Dmitri's banner, and he screamed a single word. Now, in the forest, Prince Vladimir Andreevich had been watching hell unfold for 3 hours. 3 hours of listening to his countrymen die. 3 hours of his officers begging him to charge. 3 hours of watching the Russian army being systematically destroyed while he sat motionless with 20,000 cavalry. The psychological torture was beyond description. Some of his men were weeping. Others prayed constantly. A few had vomited from the stress of inaction. But Vladimir had held, trusting Dmitri's judgment against every visible fact. Think about what holding that reserve required. 20,000 men, hidden in forest barely 800 yards from the battlefield, listening to screams, watching dust clouds rise, knowing their brothers and sons were dying. Every instinct, every military principle screamed at them to charge. Yet Vladimir had kept them frozen, his sword raised high, promising to kill any man who moved before the signal. Here's what made Vladimir's patience tactically brilliant. Those 20,000 cavalry were Russia's only uncommitted force. Use them too early, and the Mongols would adapt, wheel to face the new threat, use their superior numbers to crush the ambush. Use them too late, and there'd be no army left to save. The timing had to be perfect. The Mongols needed to be psychologically committed to victory, formations broken, discipline abandoned, attention focused entirely on the slaughter before them. The runner crashes into the forest, his horse foaming, and Vladimir sees Dmitri's banner. The single word "now" cuts through 3 hours of agonizing doubt. Vladimir lowers his sword, and the forest erupts. 20,000 cavalry, fresh horses, fresh men who've been building rage like pressure in a sealed vessel, explode from concealment like lightning from a storm cloud. The sound is thunder made flesh. 20,000 horses moving from standing to full gallop, trees splintering as cavalry bursts through undergrowth. War cries in a dozen Russian dialects rising to challenge heaven itself. They're not just attacking, they're releasing 3 hours of helpless fury. The Mongol left flank, 3 miles away from the forest, has perhaps 45 seconds before impact. 45 seconds for warriors focused on killing Russians to their front to realize death is coming from their side. 45 seconds to wheel, to form defensive positions, to prepare for what's about to hit them. It won't be enough. Not nearly enough. What's coming isn't a cavalry charge, it's an avalanche with swords. Vladimir lowered his sword, and 20,000 Russian cavalry exploded from the forest, like a dam bursting. They'd been still for 3 hours, watching their countrymen die, building rage like pressure in a sealed vessel. Now that vessel broke open, and what poured out was 20,000 men who transcended fear and entered something like ecstasy. They hit the Mongol left flank at full gallop, and for the Mongols, it was like being struck by lightning from a clear sky. 3 hours of grinding combat had convinced them they'd won, that Russian resistance was broken, that this was just the final slaughter before the rout. The sudden appearance of 20,000 fresh cavalry shattered that certainty in an instant. The Mongol warriors facing Vladimir's charge literally froze, their minds unable to process what their eyes were seeing. Where had they come from? How many more were hidden? In battle, hesitation is death. The first 1,000 Mongols were simply trampled, going down under hooves before they could react. The next 3,000 broke immediately, panic spreading like flame through dry grass. But Vladimir wasn't just hitting them. He was driving deep, angled toward where Mamay sat on his hilltop, where the Mongol command structure watched in growing horror as their certain victory transformed into chaos. The physics of the impact were devastating. 20,000 horses at full gallop, each weighing 1,200 pounds with a 200-pound rider, hitting at 30 miles per hour. The kinetic energy was measured in thousands of tons. The Mongol left flank, already disordered from pursuing routed Russians, had no formation to absorb the shock. They were individuals, not a unit, and individuals die fast. By 1:05 p.m., Vladimir's wedge had penetrated a mile into Mongol lines. A mile. Think about that penetration depth. His cavalry had smashed through 10,000 warriors, leaving a trail of carnage that looked like a plow had torn through human flesh. The Mongols directly in his path were destroyed. Those on the sides, seeing their comrades annihilated, began edging away. Edging became backing. Backing became fleeing. Here's what made this charge, militarily, revolutionary. Vladimir didn't fan out to maximize casualties. He kept his 20,000 in a tight wedge, sacrificing width for penetration depth. The goal wasn't to kill every Mongol. It was to break their cohesion, to create the psychological impression that Russian cavalry was infinite. that they'd been hiding armies in those forests. The panic started on the Mongol left, but spread like plague. Warriors engaged with the Russian center heard the screaming behind them, saw dust clouds rising from the forest, and their discipline cracked. When you've been fighting for 3 hours, exhaustion makes fear contagious. The Mongol wings, which had scattered pursuing routed Russians, suddenly found themselves wondering how many more surprises the Russians had prepared. Mamay watches from his hilltop as Vladimir's wedge drives toward him. And for the first time in his military career, he feels genuine fear. His left flank is collapsing. His center is bogged down. His wings are scattered. And now, 20,000 fresh Russian cavalry are carving through his army like a sword through silk. At 1:10 p.m., he gives the order that will haunt Russian chronicles for centuries. Sound the retreat. The most powerful Mongol army in 50 years is about to run from Russians. What happens in the next hour will be remembered as the greatest massacre in medieval warfare. What happened between 1:30 p.m. and 4 p.m. defied military logic so completely that historians still struggle to explain it. An army of 200,000 doesn't simply collapse. But the Mongol formation, overextended, overcommitted, suddenly attacked from an unexpected direction, did something unprecedented. It disintegrated. The left flank, hit by Vladimir's charge, didn't just retreat, it fled. 20,000 warriors streaming away from the battle. Their panic infected the center, which had been grinding against the Russian square for 3 hours and was exhausted. When they saw their own left wing running, they wavered. And in battle, wavering becomes breaking, becomes routing faster than thought. By 2 p.m., 50,000 Mongols were in full flight. By 2:30, 100,000. The Russian center, compressed to the breaking point minutes before, suddenly found the pressure released. They surged forward, not in organized attack, but in the awful momentum of men who'd stood on the edge of death and now saw their enemies' backs. The pursuit became a massacre. Exhausted Russians, who should have collapsed from fatigue, somehow found strength to chase fleeing Mongols for miles. The death toll defied comprehension. Of 200,000 Mongol warriors who'd woken that morning expecting easy victory, fewer than 90,000 would see sunset. Here's what made the rout so catastrophic. The Mongols were trapped by their own success. They'd driven the Russians back toward the Don River, which meant retreat required them to run through the same killing ground they'd just conquered. The field was carpeted with bodies. 45,000 Russian dead, creating obstacles that slowed fleeing horses. Mongol cavalry, bred for speed on open steppe, stumbled over corpses, riders thrown, trampled by their own comrades behind them. By 2 p.m., the killing reached industrial scale. Vladimir's 20,000 cavalry, having shattered the left flank, wheeled and hit the Mongol center from the side. The Russian infantry center, which had been dying for 3 hours, surged forward with the desperate energy of men who'd expected death and suddenly glimpsed survival. The Mongols found themselves trapped between two Russian forces, both composed of men who transcended normal human limitations. The casualty numbers from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. alone stagger belief. 30,000 Mongol dead in 60 minutes. 500 deaths per minute. The Russians weren't fighting anymore. They were butchering. Mongol warriors threw down weapons to run faster. They abandoned armor. Some stripped naked, believing lighter weight meant faster escape. It didn't matter. Russian cavalry, their horses somehow finding impossible reserves of strength, ran them down anyway. Here's where geography became destiny. The Don and Nepriadva rivers formed natural barriers, funneling fleeing Mongols into narrow corridors. At the river crossings, traffic jams of desperate warriors formed. Men pushed into the water wearing armor. Hundreds drowned. Others were trampled by those behind them. The river literally ran red. Chroniclers on both sides recorded this detail independently. Mamay himself fled at 2:15 p.m., abandoning his hilltop command post, his golden standard, his treasury. He rode east with perhaps 5,000 of his personal guard, the fastest horses in the horde. Behind him, his empire's military might was being systematically erased. The Genoese crossbowmen, trapped by slower retreat speed, were slaughtered to the last man. The Alan and Circassian allies, seeing their Mongol leaders flee, broke, and ran, only to be caught and killed by Russian cavalry that seemed to be everywhere. By 4 p.m., Kulikovo field had become a vision from the apocalypse. 110,000 Mongol corpses covered 3 square miles. The survivors, fewer than 90,000 from an army of 200,000, were scattered across 50 miles of steppe, running for their lives. Russia had lost 65,000 men. 65,000 dead from 150,000 engaged. Nearly half their army destroyed. But they'd won. They'd done the impossible. They'd broken the Golden Horde. What none of them knew yet was that this victory would birth a new problem, one far more dangerous than Mamay had ever been.